Hi, my name is David Koblenz. I'm the leader instructor at the Decatur School of Arms. I have with me my wife, Dory Koblenz, also an instructor at the Decatur School of Arms. Today we're going to talk about a particular disarm that shows up in several different Rapier treatises. We're going to talk about how the different authors handle it a little bit differently, and then we're going to talk about some ways that we can practice training it. This particular disarm ignores one of the fundamental concepts of Italian Rapier, which is that as a general rule, you should always counterattack or parry with your true edge placed in opposition to your opponent's weapon. So for instance, if I come on guard and I invite in fourth, and my opponent attacks me on my outside line, the proper response is to parry with my hand in second. Or likewise, I can counterattack with my hand in second. This protects me while hitting my opponent. Now, I might be able, in the same situation, to hook around their blade in fourth and still hit her. However, this doesn't do anything to actually protect me. This particular disarm lets us bypass this fundamental rule of opposition in Rapier by using our offhand to protect us as we attack with improper closure. For instance, if my opponent comes on guard and engages me on her outside line and makes an attack to my inside line, I can parry with my offhand while striking her with my hand in fourth rather than in second. And then using this leverage that I have against her body, I can rotate her weapon down and pull and disarm her from here. One of the earliest Italian rapier masters to talk about this technique is Rodolfo Capp, who published in 1610. Instead of using single sword, he uses rapier and dagger to illustrate this technique. He begins by having the opponent make an engagement on their inside line with their dagger held near their elbow over their arm. This invites an attack to the outside high line. As I attack, my opponent parries with their dagger, attacks with their sword, and then once they've hit me, they pivot downward, wrenching control of the weapon from my hand. The Palace of Armada was published in 1639 in England by an anonymous author. However, it fits pretty squarely within the Italian tradition. In this text, the author uses the same disarm, but with single sword, and in opposition to the opponent's riposte, rather than as a counterattack. So in this case, I come on guard, inviting on my outside line, and my opponent comes on guard and makes an attack towards my outside high line. I parry to my outside with the false edge with my hand in fourth. As I riposte, my opponent pivots their hand around my weapon, parries with their offhand, and then uses the leverage to disarm me. So one more time, I invite in fourth, my opponent attacks, I parry, on my riposte, she pivots around my arm and hits and does the disarm. Another Italian fencing master, Albany Area, published his text in Padua in 1632. He uses the single sword for this technique, and he accomplishes it either as a first intention attack or as a feint and disengage. So, for instance, I can come on guard in third, but instead of a good third, which he says opens my inside line, I'm in a third which exposes my outside line. I might do this by angling my tip slightly on the inside. This gives an opening to my outside line, so when my opponent attacks, she can attack in third over my arm, using her hand to parry my weapon as before, and then take it away. One more time. So I have a third, but instead of a good third, which if she attacks into in third, is going to be very hard to hit, I have a slightly bad third with a little bit of an opening on my outside line. This gives her the opportunity to attack in third, and while parrying with her offhand. Likewise, if she could also make a feint to my inside line, and as I attack, she can disengage to my outside line and do the same thing. So maybe in this case I've got a better third, so she feints to my inside. As I parry, she attacks and then disarms me. One more time. I get invited third, she feints, disengages, hits, and disarms me. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we can practice and train these techniques. So the first thing that I can do is I can practice the technique as it's been written. So for instance, my opponent comes on guard, engages in fourth, and as I attack, she makes the disarm. We can also add an additional step to this in a way similar to one of the authors who came after Capp and describes some of the techniques that he learned from Capp, Sebastian Heisler. He uses a similar technique to teach a similar action, but we can easily modify this to work with a dagger, to work with this particular disarm. So my opponent comes on guard and makes an attack on my invitation, makes an attack to my inside line. She recovers back to fourth, dropping her dagger next to her arm. So this sets her up for the disarm. So when I attack, she's ready for it. So we can do this again. We can also practice the Palace of Armada's version of this by having my opponent make an attack towards my outside line. And depending on my response, she may or may not need to make this disarm. As I invite to my outside line, my opponent can attack, and if I do nothing, she hits. On the other hand, if I parry, then she does the disarm. One way that we can practice this from Alfieri's version of the technique is to set up a simple drill where when I make a good engagement, my opponent can attack me with a feint by disengagement and then do the disarm against my parry of her feint. However, if I make a bad engagement, she can make a simple attack into me and hitting with the disarm immediately. So for instance, if I come on guard, and I make a bad engagement of third, she can make her initial attack land. On the other hand, if I make a good engagement of third, she might need to feint, and then she can do the disarm. So that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching. One thing to keep in mind when you practice is that this disarm can put a considerable amount of force against the opponent's wrist. And if they're not ready for it, it's very easier to injure them, especially if they have a tight grip. So please be careful when you practice this. You'll notice that in our videos, we tend to do this in two movements, where we get the hit and then we make the disarm. There's two reasons for this. One is that we want the hit to happen before the disarm because the point of the weapon helps provide leverage to make the disarm possible. The second is that we want to be kind of nice to our opponent and not break their hand.